The handling of a tender for Australia's overseas broadcasting service has been a mess from start to finish. Last night, Cabinet gave the job to the ABC permanently, despite the fact that Sky News reportedly won the independent process. 2 investigations into the untidy tender are continuing. Sky is considering making a compensation claim, and the government admits that has a fair chance of success. The opposition believes the process was corrupted, and shortly I'll be talking to the Shadow Communications Minister Malcolm Turnbull. But first, here's political editor Chris Uhlmann.
The Australian government began broadcasting offshore in the shadow of the Second World War.
And on December the 20th, 1939, Australia too joined the battle of the airwaves.
Australia calling. Australia calling. Australia calling the world.
In 1950, Radio Australia was handed to the ABC by the Menzies government. It wanted the British model of holding its soft diplomacy at arm's length, unlike the Voice of America, which is a US government agency.
Now this is the story of the great big giant and the little boy Jack.
Hello everyone, I'm Jack.
In 1993, the ABC expanded overseas broadcasting to television.
The ABC switches on Australia's first international service tonight.
But the Howard government had issues with the ABC.
For those who... good God, I'll have to train these animals a bit better, won't I? It's not the ABC, is it?
It commissioned a review by businessman Bob Mansfield, who recommended the ABC end overseas broadcasting.
A lot of drastic actions have to be taken.
Among those, international broadcasting through Radio Australia and Australia Television Go, saving up to $20 million a year.
Radio Australia was spared, but its funding was slashed and the government sold its shortwave radio transmitters. The television service wasn't so lucky.
He says Australia Television should be closed down if it can't find a buyer in the next 4 months.
The ABC's international TV arm was eventually handed to Channel 7. It ran at a loss. So in 2001, the federal government got back into broadcasting.
You're watching ABC Asia Pacific. From the region, for the region.
The new service will be funded directly by the federal government, contributing $90 million over 5 years.
I think this television service will do a great deal for Australia's standing in the Asia-Pacific region.
In 2005, the government put the Asia-Pacific service out to tender and the ABC won over newcomer Sky. So the Australian government's view of overseas broadcasting and the relative importance it places on so-called soft diplomacy has been vexed for a long time. It's oscillated between enthusiasm and neglect, more or less direct involvement and public or private broadcasting. But the recent tale of the government and the Australian network is utterly bewildering.
Now there is this strange process where the government decided to put the service up for tender again. I guess there was some controversy within government about whether that tender process should go ahead. Having decided to open the tender, though, it was incumbent on government to run it properly, and that's where I think it has really run off the rails.
In February, the Foreign Minister announced an open tender for the 10-year contract to run the Australian network worth $223 million. The ABC bid, so did Sky, which is part-owned by News Corporation.
I am
Sky News.
Sky's ownership is important because many members of the Gillard government have a large beef with News, none more so than the Communications Minister Stephen Conroy, who also oversees the ABC.
But the Daily Telegraph is interested in distorting the debate, is interested in demanding an election campaign purely intended to try and get rid of the government.
Kevin Rudd had oversight of the original tender because the money to fund the Australian network comes from his department. But the bids were sent to an independent evaluation board made up of senior bureaucrats. The Foreign Minister's office confirmed in April that the final decision maker would be the Secretary of his department, Dennis Richardson, and that Cabinet would not have a role. But in early June it was clear that something was amiss.
Mr Richardson, can you explain to me why you think there is a problem in advising who actually within government is the final decision maker for this contract?
I can only say that I would need to take that on advice.
Some ministers were appalled that Cabinet wouldn't have the final say, even though the Prime Minister's office had ticked off on the decision. And then in June, something extraordinary happened. The Communications Minister was put in charge of a process that was being run by the Foreign Minister's department.
Why aren't you the final approver?
Well, I'll draw your attention to what Senator Conroy said today in the Senate, and it's a remark with which I completely concur, and that is the decision maker, in effect, is the Cabinet itself.
The reasons given for delaying the tender process were as odd as the process itself: the rise of the Arab Spring, the emergence of foreign markets. In short, how news organisations would cover news.
So both tenderers then went back to the drawing board and re-tendered. They would then expect a decision as a result of that.
In July, news leaked that Sky had won the independent tender process, and 2 ministers complained that ABC executives had acted inappropriately by lobbying them over the tender.
I think there was nothing in our behaviour around this process that we have any questions about, and we're relaxed with how we went about putting our case.
Last month, Stephen Conroy announced that the tender would be terminated because of the leaks, and the Australian Federal Police were called in to investigate. The Auditor-General is also investigating.
What happened here was that there were several leaks that compromised the process, and having seen that happen, it was appropriate to bring the process to an end.
Last night, Cabinet ended the whole sorry mess and handed the ABC the contract permanently.
We needed to make a decision for the future which would give certainty. We've made that decision, and we've taken the public policy choice that this function should be with the ABC.
The ABC is delighted.
So we think it'll be more efficient and more effective for us, but certainly better for our audiences, and certainly better, stronger branding of Australia's international broadcasting arm for the nation.
Sky is outraged and demanding compensation, and the government has lots of questions to answer.
Look, I think that they have a fair case.
It's yet another illustration of the poisonous dysfunction at the heart of this government. You've got a Prime Minister and a Foreign Minister who can't stand the sight of each other, who can't work together.
Prime Minister, do you like Kevin Rudd?
Look, Kevin Rudd and I are working together in the interests of the nation.
And it does seem that, in fact, the government decided that it didn't like that decision and that it was going to have to find some way to find its way back to giving the contract to the ABC, all of which is completely inappropriate in an open tender process, and that's where the process has been corrupted.